Hey, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, yeah. You looking for somewhere to plug in? Just go to, well, you can go the one behind, or the one across, whichever. Hey, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yeah. Hey, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Hey, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Yeah. Hey, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Please let me fix my hair first. So it? Yeah. Everyone good? Hey, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Hey, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. It's not that cold. 4. Okay. Hey, 1, 2. Yeah. 2. Yeah. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah. Go on.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Sure, have a white balance while you're at it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. When I move, you okay?
very dark here, is it?
Thanks everybody for coming.
Huh? Well, if the cabinet was very long, I didn't realise how short or long the cabinet would go, and then I have to get, obviously, I can come back. Well, I won't be here too long because I have to go back into for the houses, shortly. So.
Teaching gives under a bit of time pressure, so we'll have a few statements first. Teaching will take some questions, and you'll have to leave. The other ministers will then have to take questions after. So, Teaching.
Now, first of all, I'm very pleased to join with my cabinet colleagues, with Mr. Brown having approved the gambling regulation bill at today's government meeting. I want to acknowledge and commend Minister McEntee, and in particular my colleague Minister James Brown, for pioneering this modern, comprehensive and robust legislation to regulate how gambling is licensed in our country. I know Minister Brown has put enormous work into this over the last 2.5 years. This long-awaited and much-needed bill takes a responsible approach. It introduces serious new safeguards to protect people from falling prey to gambling addiction, while also balancing the freedom to enjoy responsible gambling. This bill provides a clearer framework for operators and for consumers. Under the legislation, a new dedicated body is being established to carry out these licensing and regulatory functions. And I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate Anne-Marie Caulfield on her appointment to her new role as CEO designate of the Gambling Regulatory Authority of Ireland. It is a very important role, and I wish her the very best of luck in her work. It has taken time to bring forward this legislation, but as we have seen with the introduction of any major national public health initiative, from our workplace smoking ban to Minister McEntee's recently published alcohol licensing bill, it is important to deal with the full spectrum of considerations and ensure that we get it right. There are, of course, many people in our country who enjoy a bet and for whom it's part of their social life, but we must also acknowledge and safeguard against the truly awful impact that gambling addiction can and does have on some people, families and communities. I believe that with this bill we are taking an important step forward in promoting responsible behaviour on the part of both the gambling industry and consumers through robust regulations. Crucially, the legislation ensures that the authority will have significant enforcement powers to penalise those who break the rules. Even more importantly, those seeking to tackle problem gambling behaviours or addiction will be directed towards the help they need through built-in mechanisms like an exclusionary register and other safeguards. The Social Impact Fund, funded from the industry, would support initiatives to reduce and eliminate compulsive and excessive gambling. Overall, I believe that Minister Brown has achieved the right balance with this legislation. I look forward to its enactment and to seeing the Gambling Regulatory Authority of Ireland up and running next year. When gambling becomes a problem for an individual or a family, the impact can be absolutely devastating. The steps we are taking today to recognise and help protect against that damage is, as I've said, important work. And once again, thanks to you, James, Helen, your officials, and everyone involved in getting us to this point, and Roderick for his department's input and consultations as well.
Thank you, Taoiseach. I'm delighted to be here with you this morning to mark the approval of the Gambling Regulation Bill. As outlined by the Taoiseach, this bill is an important and necessary piece of legislation designed to meet the challenges of the gambling responsibly in the 21st century. The bill sets out the framework for a robust regulatory and licensing regime for the gambling sector. At the heart of the bill is the establishment of the Gambling Regulatory Authority of Ireland, an independent body equipped to enforce regulation of the gambling sector. The bill will ensure that the authority can appropriately, meaningfully and swiftly respond to ongoing and future developments in the gambling sector. The authority will have an important role of setting the parameters within which the industry operates. In September of this year, Ms. Anne-Marie Caulfield was appointed CEO designate of the authority. Ms. Caulfield is working closely with my department to identify staffing and resourcing needs and to develop procedures for how the authority will function once it's operational. Ms. Caulfield's ongoing preparatory work, in parallel with the passage of the Gambling Regulation Bill, will ensure that the authority will be ready to hit the ground running once it is formally established. Strict regulation of gambling advertising will be a priority area for the authority. under the legislation, advertising intended to appeal to children and advertising that promotes excessive or compulsive gambling will be prohibited. A watershed prohibiting gambling advertising at certain times of the day between 5:30 a.m. and 9 p.m. will be introduced. In this digital age, to address the particular proliferation of gambling advertising on social media, such advertising will be prohibited by default. The bill will allow the authority to prescribe the times, places and events where gambling advertising can be broadcast, displayed or published. The authority will be able to specify the frequency which advertising can be broadcast, the duration of advertisements and the amount of advertisements that can be shown. The bill provides for a modern and streamlined approach to gambling licensing activities, which will replace the currently fragmented regime. 3 types of licenses for both in-person and online or remote betting will be introduced: business-to-consumer gaming, betting and lottery licenses, business-to-business licenses, and gambling licenses for charitable and philanthropic causes. Operators will apply to the authority to acquire or renew a license. The authority will have the power to set the criteria which operators must fulfil to acquire a license. The authority may also amend the conditions attached to licenses. Any person that provides a gambling activity without a gambling license issued by the authority, or that does not operate in accordance with the type of gambling license held by that person, shall be guilty of an offence. Those found guilty shall be liable to conviction to up to 8 years imprisonment and or a fine at the discretion of the courts. With respect to enforcement more broadly, the overall policy intention is to encourage compliance rather than to enforce penalties for non-compliance. However, where penalties are appropriate, the authority will have robust powers to impose a wide array of sanctions, from relatively mild to potentially severe. The bill will also provide for a range of offences that can result in prosecution. The authority, in the exercise of all of its compliance and enforcement functions, will operate on the basis of fairness, due process and fair procedures, which are built into the provisions of the bill. The bill also puts forward measures to minimise the ill effects of gambling. The bill proposes to prohibit the use of credit methods of payment and the offer of credit facilities to players. It is really important that people cannot gamble on credit cards and get themselves into debt because of that. The bill also proposes a ban on inducements and a ban on ATM facilities in certain premises. An exclusionary register will be established that will allow people to register with the authority to exclude themselves from gambling online with licensees. A social impact fund will be created and managed by the authority, funded from the industry. It will be used to finance initiatives to reduce problem gambling and support awareness raising and educational measures. The fund will be financed by mandatory contributions calculated annually on a licensee's turnover, with an exemption granted to charitable and philanthropic licensees. Once again, I'm very happy to be announcing the publication of the Gambling Regulation Bill and the establishment of the Gambling Regulatory Authority of Ireland. The bill will provide for an improved and modern approach to the licensing and regulation of gambling in Ireland today. The authority will set up the infrastructure to facilitate this environment for many years to come, and I thank my colleagues for their support. Thank you.
Thanks, James. We're really pleased to join you this afternoon. Really pleased the Government has approved the Gambling Regulation Bill. I want to sincerely thank Minister of State James Bryan for the huge amount of work that he has done in getting it to this point, but also to acknowledge my colleague David Stanton, who had done a huge amount of work prior to this. I think this bill represents the culmination of a considerable amount of work, as I've just said. It's also a programme for government commitment and something we've said very clearly we wanted to implement as quickly as possible in this government. The legislative framework for licensing and regulation, it's outdated, it's lacking a coherent approach. It was enacted at the early stages of the state, so while it's been amended over time, I think in particular the changes to online and how people are gambling online really means that we need to have legislation that is up to date, that's more cohesive, and I think this bill very much does that. Obviously the industry, it's quite a significant industry. It's estimated to be worth between 6 and 10 billion euros, so there's a lot of jobs, a lot of employment that's generated through us. It's obviously, as the Taoiseach has said, a source of great enjoyment for a lot of people, but I don't think we can ignore the fact that it can have significant detriment impacts on those, particularly those who become addicted to gambling, and I think we all know individuals who have found themselves in that scenario, so there have to be safeguards in place to protect individuals, particularly young children, from getting sucked into a problematic type behaviour. The pace of technology, as I've said, poses a significant challenge in making sure that we have the right regulatory framework to be able to respond, but I do think the bill achieves that objective. The Gambling Regulation Bill is a considered bill, it's very comprehensive, it's taken the approach which I think meets the expectation of our society now, but also looks beyond and what might change into the future as well. The fact that it paves the way for the Gambling Regulatory Authority I think is very positive. The bill will put the authority on a very firm statutory footing to carry out its business, while also again providing that flexibility to be able to change and adjust as things change and adjust into the future. The Minister has obviously outlined the authority's goals and the approach that they will take and the overall objective that they have, and it's really positive that work has already started. So just to congratulate and acknowledge the CEO designate of the authority, Anne Marie Caulfield, who has been busy preparing the ground already. She has extensive experience working not just in the public but the private sector, and has a lot of regulatory policy and operational regulatory experience, having held position of Director of the Residential Tenancies Board for 8 years. There's also a programme board that has already been established to ensure that the legislation and also the operational preparedness is ready once this legislation comes into effect after it's enacted. Ultimately, I suppose the legislation is there to make sure that gambling is carried out in a fair way, that it's in an open way for companies to make decisions in certainty, but above all that we protect people who are vulnerable, and that we make sure resources through the social fund as well go back into making sure that we can communicate but also support where people have addiction problems and where they need additional support as well. So again, just to sincerely thank James for the huge amount of work that has gone into this, and to wish Ms Caulfield well in her future role.
Roderick.
Thanks very much. So I'm pleased to be here alongside the Taoiseach, Minister McEntee and Minister Brown for the launch of the Gambling Regulation Bill. I think this bill, at long last, will overhaul and modernise the regulation of gambling in Ireland in line with those commitments that were set out in the programme for government. And as Minister with responsibility for children and youth, I'm particularly pleased to see that the legislation will focus on the prevention of harm to people who are vulnerable to problem gambling, to children and to young people. In particular, I'd highlight maybe the ban on advertising before a watershed, a ban on sponsoring of children's activities by gambling companies, and also restrictions on the use of ads on merchandise. I think we all realise that gambling and the gambling industry has changed hugely over the last 2 decades, and the proliferation of advertising has been really stark, and anybody who watches sport on TV can attest to that fact. And the ever-changing but also the technologically advanced nature of the gambling industry means that children and teenagers are more exposed than ever to both overt and subtle gambling advertising. And it's important that this is properly regulated to ensure that where gambling is advertised, it's done in a way that minimises harmful influences to young people, because we know that whether it be through sports or online gambling, children can be particularly exposed to gambling advertising. And I believe that through the establishment of the Gambling Regulatory Authority, backed by strong enforcement powers, as well as the crucial safeguards and protections in relation to the protection of children, ensuring public safety and well-being, this legislation marks a really important point in efforts to safeguard children and young people from the impacts of gambling. And I want to thank Minister McEntee and Minister Brown for all their efforts in terms of delivering this legislation, and I look forward to seeing its rapid passage through the Oireachtas.
Thank you.
Thank you. Just a couple of matters for clarification about the subject of the bill itself. So I don't know whether this is for Minister Lawless or Minister McEntee, whichever of you can clarify it. Does the National Lottery fall under this review, or will it still retain its own sort of a parallel regulatory system? And on a similar note, will the same prohibition on advertising apply to the National Lottery? Will this also extend to the prohibition of sponsorship by gambling companies of other TV programming, because often sports programming can be sponsored by bookmakers, so will that be outlawed under the time window? And also just Taoiseach, because I know you have to go, so if I can ask you just on a separate issue. Obviously in the aftermath of yesterday's passing of Vicky Phelan, there's been more attention drawn to the absence of any legislation right now on open disclosure. It's been 4 years since that was promised by the previous government. It is still something which is in the works. Would you like to see that now expedited in light of yesterday's news?
So just in relation to the National Lottery, that remains under its own bespoke legislation within the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform, and is not covered by anything under this piece of legislation here. And in relation to the sponsorship, a lot of sponsorship that's called sponsorship is in fact advertising, I think, when you look at it, so that will certainly be covered. And there's several aspects within the legislation dealing with very specific sponsorship situations as well, but in particular anything related to children, where children are involved, sponsorship will not be allowed.
Sir, for clarification, can that apply to programming which originates overseas, or is that if you're watching something which was natively
Yeah, so if Sky Sports are providing a service into Ireland, they will not be allowed to have the advertising. There is a challenge, obviously, if there's advertising hoarding, for example, at the back of a sports match, we're not going to be able to regulate that. That's in the UK.
Could I just deal with the, just with Gavin's question? First of all, I think there's been an enormous response across the public following the passing of, the very sad passing of Vicky Phelan, I think, which reflects the enormous respect, affection and esteem in which Vicky was held. And I think the fundamental point that she made at the time coming out of the High Court was the right to have access to information in respect of one's health, and that there should be no restriction to access to information pertaining to one's health. And then the broader issue of mandatory reporting more generally, which has been an issue in child protection for quite a long time and contested and so on. But I'm informed by the Minister for Health that legislation, in the context of the patient safety legislation, is at report stage. It's gone through committee stage in the House, and that it will be back in early December, is what he is saying to me now, for completion. And that would be, I think, the intention of everybody in the Oireachtas to try and get that completed.
Yeah, just a couple of specific questions as well. Have you arrived at a figure for the levy that will be applied on gambling companies? What will the situation be in relation to sponsorship of soccer teams like happens in the UK? I presume that will be prohibited under the legislation. And how will the Irish Regulatory Authority be able to capture the proliferation of online gambling that takes place? I mean, it would be impossible for an Irish-based authority to capture all of the betting activity that takes place online. Is there going to be a limit to what the authority can do in relation to policing gambling and imposing restrictions?
So in relation to advertising online, the advertising is prohibited unless you opt in to receive. So if you're, for example, signing up to some online service, you will have to opt in to receive gambling advertising. The base point is it's prohibited. In relation to the powers of local authority, the powers of the regulatory authority, they have extensive enforcement powers, but they can go as far as getting an order to get the ISP provider to take down the content that has been provided into Ireland as well. So not only can they tackle the licensee, the regulatory authority will be able to get an order to get the ISP provider, so to take down what they are actually allowing to be shown here in the Republic if it is an unlicensed activity. In relation to the levy, that will have to be set by the regulatory authority. It will be based on the turnover of each individual licensee, but it's about how an assessment will have to be made as what that global fund is needed to address what is the public health element of the legislation. I think the sponsorship piece. So what we've done with sponsorship is that any sponsorship targeted towards children will be banned. Any sponsorship where children are involved in a club, it will be banned. So if it's an adult-only sport where there's no children members of the club, that will be allowed. But if there's children members of that club, you won't be allowed to have sponsorship. If you have somebody under 18 playing the team, the sponsorship won't be allowed. So it's very, very restrictive without going to the point of a complete ban.
Clarity on the online advertising element of it. How can you prohibit, let's say, pop-ups coming up when a child is watching something on YouTube, for example, in daytime hours or expected? Just is that even feasible or possible? And Taoiseach, to go back to Vicky Phelan, the only reason we know the story of Cervical Check and Vicky Phelan is because she waived that non-disclosure element. How do you stand over the state still seeking private settlements or NDAs in cases, numerous cases, given the good that came out of Vicky Phelan waiving that? And also on the Dying for Dignity bill, or Dying with Dignity bill, it was something that Vicky Phelan had wanted in her lifetime. She didn't see that. Can you promise that Dying with Dignity bill, or a version of it, will be enacted in the lifetime of this government?
So again, in relation to the online piece, the regulatory authority will have very powerful and robust powers in relation to licensing, monitoring and enforcement. So if that pop-up for gambling is coming from a licensed company, then they may be committing a serious offence, and the regulatory authority can take action against that licensee. If it is from somebody or a company or an agent that is not licensed in the Republic, they can take action against the ISP provider. So whoever is allowing that content to be streamed down through the broadband, if you like, for example. So they have a lot of powers there and an enforcement and to monitor it as well. So I think insofar as it can be done, it is always going to be a challenge keeping on top of technological changes, but the regulatory authority is being given every power that it will need insofar as it can regulate and control that type of situation.
In terms of the State Claims Agency, as you know, as a result of legislation passed some years ago, takes all legal claims on behalf of the state in respect to a wide range of issues, and it's been a principle in respect to legal principles that clause has been invoked, although I believe there should be its fullest, anything involving the state or anything involving access to information, for example, that a wider cohort of people would need access to. In my view, there should be full transparency in that regard in terms of any particular case in respect of health information, or that if one case impacts on a wider set of cases, that people will have access to that information to affirm their rights in respect of that. The second part of your question was the
Dying with Dignity bill. Can you promise that will be enacted under your government? Again,
that has been examined, but there are different perspectives on that. It is a very, very complex issue. And I do know that Vicky was very strongly of a view that should come in, and that facility should be there. And I think there will be, it's work in progress, but there are different approaches to it, to be honest, as well. You know, other people have different perspectives in relation to the entire issue of dying with dignity. And again, like many issues of that kind, it does need further teasing out, more discussion, and to bring as many people as possible into the discussion and into the debate, because it's not a simple issue by any means.
Taoiseach, on that confidentiality clause, do you think that they should be done away with and the state should not be asking people to send them privately?
The state, through the State Claims Agency, and again I think in certain issues, particularly ones of public interest or public health concerns, there should be full transparency. But again, that's something we'll keep on the review and examine. I'd like to hear other views and perspectives on that before making final decisions in respect of it. Okay.
Just on the matter of the fines, is there a threshold that people will be fined to if they don't follow through on these new rules and the new regulations coming in? And then Minister McEntee, just to come back to Vicky Phelan, do you have any regrets, or do you think the government should have any regrets? Obviously it was your party in government at the time when this all came out. Is there regrets there about the way that Vicky was treated, you know, the fact that she wasn't told about the misread smears and all these kind of things? Do you think that the state apology that was issued went far enough, or do you think there should have been more of a fulsome apology there for her?
So just in relation to the fines, it is a matter for the discretion of the courts. They will always retain that type of discretion, but it is up to 20 million euros or 10% of turnover, which is ever as higher as the upper limit on it.
Just on that, I suppose I think current government as well as the previous government have acknowledged that a lot of mistakes were made, that changes needed to and still have to come out of what happened. I just want to acknowledge Vicky's passing and acknowledge the significant contribution that she has made, in particular to women's health and making sure that other women don't go through what she has gone through. Minister Harris obviously introduced legislation in 2019, and I think we all want to see it passed as quickly as possible. I know Minister Donnelly is really keen to get through the Dáil stages by the end of this year, and that the Seanad would then pass this early New Year, so that we will see those changes brought about. But an apology was given. I don't think it will ever be enough, to be honest, for a lot of people, because of the harm that has been caused. But I think the best thing that we can do in her honour and memory and others is to bring about the change that she fought for, and that's certainly what I and others are absolutely determined to do. I think it's very clear that mistakes were made, and that's why it was acknowledged at the time, and the best thing that we can do acknowledging those mistakes are to bring about the changes that are required to make sure it doesn't happen to anybody ever again.
A question for Minister Brown in regard to the Oireachtas Justice Committee. I think they'd recommended a type of domain name system so that people tried to log on to gambling websites from abroad, that were based abroad and not operating according to the new Irish rules, that they would be blocked. I'm wondering, will that be in the bill? And just for Minister McEntee and Mr O'Gorman, you both mentioned the impact of gambling addiction. I'm just interested on your views on just how much of a scourge that has been in your experience in this country.
So how we've attempted to address the situation with, if you like, unlicensed gambling companies trying to provide service in the Republic, as I said, that are not licensed, we've given the regulatory authority the power to go after the internet service providers here in Ireland. So the companies providing that service into your home or into your company, that they can be targeted to make sure that these services are taken down and blocked from being brought in.
I mean, look, I'm speaking not as Minister for Justice or even early as a TD, but I think we've all seen the impact that gambling has had on individuals, something that I've probably seen more and more in my constituency in recent years is the age at which people are becoming addicted much younger, and unfortunately it's impacting young men more than young women, those who might come to me or seeking assistance in different ways. So I think it's important that we acknowledge, you know, as I said, a lot of people get a lot of enjoyment out of this, but it can have a detrimental impact. What I've also seen more so is that it doesn't just impact the individual themselves, but can have huge ramifications for their family, their extended family as well, because so often people want to help and want to be able to help that individual get over the financial burden that they've been landed with, and that can obviously have serious ramifications. So yes, I think it's an issue that's gotten worse, and certainly when I was in mental health, it's an issue that was raised with me quite regularly, the impact it was having on people's health.
I think, you know, as Minister, I've heard of concerns raised by NGOs advocating for children and young people, but then, like Helen, as a constituency TD, community and voluntary organisations in my own area speaking about the impact that they're seeing on young people coming to them with gambling addictions and their parents and their family and that knock-on impact, and particularly the ease with which gambling can take place now, the ease with which any young person can register online and engage in gambling, whether it's in contents on sport, whether it's in computer games and the like. So it has a very significant, very widespread impact. And I think that's why the legislation being brought forward today is so important, and it's so important that it has significant elements of it dedicated specifically to targeting the impact of gambling on children and recognising that there are needs for stronger prohibitions there vis-a-vis adults.
Minister Brown, just a couple of things to clarify. So effectively, what you're saying is any GA club would not allowed to have it because they have underage teams and whatnot, and soccer clubs and rugby clubs and so on, that they wouldn't be allowed to have gambling advertising at all, sponsorship at all. Okay.
Right.
And there'll be a total ban on advertising on social media, is that right?
Yeah, so the default position is prohibition on ban of gambling advertising.
Okay.
But if you choose, you can opt in to receive it from.
And how would that work in practical terms? How would you opt in to being
bombarded
with gambling ads?
I think probably a little bit like when you sign up to something where you already have to tick boxes, that you will have to be a very clear, specific request to you. Do you want to receive gambling advertising on this site?
Did you say as well that ATMs would be banned in bookies and?
Yeah, so they'll be banned from the likes of bookies. Not every premises. So, for example, at a horse racing stadium, you will still be able to have an ATM because people eat there, for example, and might need cash. But in actual bookies, yes, they'll be banned.
Okay. Do you envisage much pushback from the industry to this? And how much consultation have you had with them?
Well, the consultation with stakeholders took place. In fairness, David Stanton did a huge amount of work in that respect before I came in. So when I took up the position, I took the body of work that David Stanton had done in terms of all of that stakeholder engagement and took a view that I was just wanted to get this legislation drafted as quickly as possible. So I haven't met with any of the gambling industry. I think perhaps some of this they may be surprised at how strict it is, but we'll find out over the coming days. I'm sure they'll be making themselves known.
Okay, thank you.
Adam, then Aoife, and finally Ty. Minister Brown, the exclusion
preliminary register, will that work only for online, or will there be anything put in place to stop me walking into a bookies and saying, like, I don't want to be able to bet anymore? And then secondly, the sanctions. If a company breaks the advertising watershed, is it the broadcaster that is sanctioned, or is it the bookmaker that puts that advertising on?
So in relation to the exclusion register, it is only online. It would be very difficult to apply it, say, for independent bookmakers or for on-course betting. But so it will be only online in that respect. But we do envisage the regulatory authority bringing in warnings, or some people maybe are betting physically on a premises, that if they're hitting a certain amount, a warning would be given to warn them of the dangers they're participating in. Sorry, the second part was?
The sanctions, is the broadcaster that would get the sanction, or?
So it will depend on the circumstances. The broadcaster could be sanctioned. So for example, if they have an advertisement there on stock and they run it inadvertently, maybe at 6 o'clock in the evening, not sanctioned by the actual licensee, then it could be the broadcaster. But I would envisage the broadcaster, the licensee, are all potentially exposed.
And the last question, how will this impact casinos and poker tournaments and that sort of thing? Because a lot of casinos will have ATMs in their premises, plainly to protect people having to carry large amounts of money across the city and things like that.
Yeah, so you've obviously got a gamut of different types of poker games, from people just simply playing poker at home, which is no different than people drinking at home. You won't need a license. But if for the likes of the members clubs, they will require a license going forward under this legislation.
Whoever wants to answer this can. It's just a government question. So there's been 378 legal claims against Cervical Check, right? 25 of them have gone to Cervical Check Tribunal. So out of 378, only 25 have gone through the tribunal. By anybody's measure, this has been a failure. Vicky Phelan walked away from it, Stephen Deep walked away from it, and Lorraine Walsh walked away from it. The advocate said that this isn't going to work, and Stephen Donnelly powered on with it anyway. Would it not be fitting now, instead of dragging these other 300 odd women through the courts, to say we will look at the tribunal again and we will go back to the recommendations that Stephen Deep and Lorraine Walsh and Vicky Phelan had to stop this? I spoke to a woman this morning who was going through the High Court and said it is traumatising dealing with these medical experts going to these interviews. Is it not now enough to say this tribunal has been a failure, let's start again?
Maybe just initially to respond, I suppose the intention of the tribunal was to not re-traumatise women, to not have a situation where women felt they had no option but to go through the courts. I know there was a huge amount of engagement between Minister Donnelly and many of the representative group and those who are advocating on behalf of all of the women you've just mentioned. I think the number is probably lower, yes, than anybody would like or have expected. And I think that's why there is continued open engagement, and Minister Donnelly is, and I think has made clear from the outset that he's willing to engage as the process continues. It's still technically at the early stages, but I appreciate, you know, if it's not working, then it's something perhaps we need to look at, but that's obviously a decision that the Minister would have to take, and I think the government as a whole would have to take. But the whole point is to keep people out of the courts. It's not a friendly, welcoming place for anybody. It's to take the adversarial approach out of it. But if it's not working, I've no doubt that it's something that could be looked at.
Minister Brown, there was previously calls for a total ban of gambling advertising. The government have opted to look at a watershed instead. Why were there not? Was there any consideration for a total ban?
So we did look at it very carefully, and I think the decision was made. I consider that a total ban would simply be disproportionate. Gambling is a legal activity. It's carried out by many people in a safe manner, but what our aim here is to ensure that vulnerable gambling users are protected and that children are protected. So we felt this type of watershed, if you like, and bans on advertising at certain times and in certain locations will be effective. But certainly the regulatory authority will be able to keep this under review and make further recommendations to the Minister of the day if further restrictions are required.
Thanks, everybody.
Okay. Thank you, folks.